welcome. Thanks for joining us today. If you're joining us live, it is Monday. And if you're joining us recording, who knows what day it is, but we're glad to have you here. We are thrilled to have Timothy Sarrantonio with Neon One joining us today to talk to us about what time is it and when do donors donate? So Tim, we will jump into this conversation deep with you. But before we do that, we of course want to make sure that our audience knows who you're seeing or listening to. Julia Patrick is here, the American Nonprofit Academy CEO. I'm Jarrett Ransom, your nonprofit nerd, CEO of the Raven Group. And we are so thrilled to have our continued supporters. Thank you very much to Bloomerang, American Nonprofit Academy, Fundraising Academy, Nonprofit Nerd, your part-time controller, the Nonprofit Atlas, Nonprofit Thought Leader, as well as Staffing Boutique. These companies are invested in you, in your community, in your mission. They're here to support us and to allow these great conversations like the one that we are about to have with Tim from Neon One. And again, if you've missed any of our episodes, you can find them on Roku, YouTube, Fire TV, Vimeo, and also in podcast form. So make sure that you stream that and you queue up the Nonprofit Show. And today, again, thrilled to have Tim joining us. Really excited to get super nerdy with you, Tim, because you just said in the green room chatter that this chapter of the report is your favorite. So welcome back, our friend.
Well, thank you for having me. And so soon after the last time, I know that that's an honor, that not many folks have. So I really appreciate being here. But you got me on a topic that I can go on and on about. So,
unfortunately, we only have 30 minutes. But
I know.
You know that. So we're really just scratching the surface here. But let's talk about this topic. For those of you taking a look at the video, there's a nice graphic of this very beautifully done report. And we're going to dive deep into donors and understanding the future of the individual giver. And again, you're right. This is something I'm sure we could all talk hours about. And when we talk about the time continuum, that's certainly something to consider. So get us started here. What are some things that you'd like to say?
Well, so for folks that might not know what this report is, this is a new Neon One report that came out in March. And so very fresh. Yeah. And we basically wanted to answer, since March 2020, what has changed and what has maintained about how individual givers behave. And we wanted to answer 6 key questions: who, what, when, where, why, how. So by starting with that, each is a chapter, and it helped hyper focus the types of research and analysis that we did. And the when chapter is chapter 3, and that's when things really kicked into high gear, in my opinion. I think the whole report is very insightful. It talks about demographics and psychographics and kind of the psychology of things. But the when chapter, we really, I think it just blossoms in terms of really kind of sinking in and unpacking some of the deeper questions that the data presents us, because ultimately we want to act on this. A lot of reports just end up being like, I'm going to sit this on the shelf. I've been blown away since the last time that we talked. One, how many people have downloaded this thing?
Good.
If you haven't, get it.
Yeah.
And 2, how many people printed it out? Actually, like I got tagged, and we got tagged in a bunch of like Instagram posts and things like that, where people were like showing they printed it out. So, and that's I think it's because people learn in different ways too. And some folks, like, they want to be able to highlight and spend a little bit more time. That's one thing that I've had people say is, I want to make sure I have the time to focus on this. So ultimately, my final point here is time is so precious, and there's only so much in the day. Yeah. We don't live on, a different planet. And so we have 365 or whatever, depending on a leap year, days in a year, 24 hours in a day. So what are we going to do with it? What are we going to do with our time? And so we're so appreciative that people found this a useful expenditure of their time.
So before we get into more specifics, if you can paint the picture of your research, because you took a lot of information from a lot of different sources. I think sometimes we look at data and we're like, we're making a lot of decisions, but when basically the sample set has been 22 people and half of them were employees and the other half was family. You're looking at something that I feel in the statistical world is really has a lot of gravitas and really can support these theories that you've uncovered, right?
Absolutely. Thank you for that flag too, Julia, because we looked at two primary data sets when it came to time in particular. The first is with our partners at Bloomerang, Donor Perfect, and Keela, the fundraising effectiveness project, because that is going to show over near 10,000 organizations in 2021 alone we drew from, and $10 billion, right? Like, this is a lot of money. And so what was fascinating was to be able to validate what time of the month somebody's giving, what time of the year somebody's giving. So that was the big data set that we drew from there. But then what it doesn't tell you is, for instance, what time of the day somebody is giving. We have that though. So we looked at our 2.2 billion, and oh no, lost Julia.
Uh-oh. Keep nerding out. We'll be good.
Okay, we'll go. Time's a flat circle. She'll come back.
That's right.
So we also looked at our online giving behavior in particular, because that's really reliable to know what the donor is doing.
Right.
And I know for the nonprofit folks who are listening out there, you might not always enter the checks the day you receive them. So dates are important, but we know if somebody donates on their phone or through the computer or something like that, there's a timestamp. We know exactly when they hit the submit button. So we can say, this is what the donor did, not what the nonprofit professional did when it came to something like a check. Still interesting, but with online giving, we actually could tell exactly when somebody preferred to give. So we looked at a few different data sets for this type of thing, to Julia's point, but it was really fascinating to kind of see calendar year as well as day of the week. I had a theory we can get into when appropriate, Jared, in terms of.
Hey, I'm all for that. And we're just gonna, do impromptu here. Thankfully, we know the topic, and that's something that we can certainly talk about. I'd love to hear your theory, and I'd also love for you to demonstrate to us as much as well as you can, really, what the system you've provided on the report. It's interactive. We can go in, we can toggle, the time calendar. And so this is something that we can all take a look at and really play around with, because you're right, guilty as charged. We don't always, input the data right when we receive the check. But we can certainly talk and track exactly what our donors are doing. And that's really important.
So we created a data hub that lives on our website. You don't have to enter an email or anything. Anybody can go to this. It doesn't matter if you're using our product or not. And there's a few interactive elements that play actually pretty heavily with time right now. So, so if you just want to kind of get a snapshot, for instance, Jarrett, you can just go and look, and there's a clock, and the clock will actually recognize what time zone you're in and show you pretty much the from the report, the number of gifts coming in. And so so basically, let's see. Oh yeah, so here's the interface itself. Perfect timing. I'm gonna stop using the word time if I can.
Yes.
Like at least in terms of dad puns. So this is the interface, folks. It'll recognize your time zone, and you can play around and you can say like, okay. And we did actually think about should we add toggles for like day of week and things like that. And we found, for simplicity of understanding, that we'll do this as a blended analysis, but the report actually has a graph that is much more detailed around the details. And so, but we found that around 11:30 in the morning on a Thursday is when people prefer to give online. Now, my theory, Jarrett, that I was referencing was, when I originally asked to have this data point pulled, my theory was that people would get blitzed on the weekend and want to give at like, after having a few beers, basically.
Right.
So would we see a spike on a Saturday and a Sunday, like during a football game or something like that, where it's like,
When
all
that
right,
QR code is bouncing, right?
yeah, the barcode's bouncing and it's like, let's go act on it, that type of thing. That theory was completely disproven. It does not bear out other than a small blip at 8:30 on a Sunday, which might correlate to something, but in general, no, people are not bothering to give on the weekend. They're stopping to think about it. So I have further things that we need to analyze that I think you're going to be really excited about, that we're starting to think about now from an analysis standpoint. But yeah, 11:30 on a Thursday. 11:30 on a Thursday.
That's fascinating, Tim, because when we look at, marketing, when do we send emails? You're not necessarily saying this is when you send the communication. You're telling us this is when that communication's receiving reaction.
Yes.
And that to me, I would love to compare this with the marketing to say, when is the open rate? How often, what are the times that people are open?
What do you think I'm going to look at next? So
of course you are.
We have and has been so Giving Tuesday, our partners at Giving Tuesday did work on some benchmarking work with MailChimp relatively recently, but the problem with that data is it isn't necessarily really drilled down and indexed against when people might be clicking through and activating on a form, right? The MailChimp callback data is kind of labyrinthian, if I'm going to be honest. But now they're actually more geared towards small businesses because they got acquired by the people who make QuickBooks, right? So for us, we have our own email engine. That thing sent out 250 emails last year. I think that's a pretty good data set that you can draw on. And so that I hinted at it. That's actually where I want to go next, Jared, is to do that exactly, is to see when are people sending the emails and when are people opening the emails, and is there anything that lines up when it comes
correlation.
to that.
Well, I'm so glad that my crystal ball is working.
Oh,
because I'm going to go buy my lottery ticket numbers now. What about the calendar impact? How does the calendar, you mentioned 365 days a year, unless it's leap year. So how does that impact our culture of philanthropy in relation to that donor engagement?
So this is one of the they're all fascinating, obviously, but I think that one of the most interesting questions that fundraising consultant T. Clay Buck brought up when he started thinking about this was, have we conditioned donors to give in something like December?
Yeah.
Is that when we're asking them, or do they prefer that? Mm-hmm. And I think there's some interesting things that don't paint a clear one way or the other that I can unpack right now. So one of the funny parts is that, like, one of our best performing blogs, for instance, is end of the year statistics that every nonprofit fundraiser should know. It's just like everybody like Googles it and it pops up. And one of the ones at the top is like 31% of gifts come in December. And I was like, is that true anymore? So we're gonna have to update the blog, spoiler, and that's fine. That's fine. And it actually turns out that was some old data from Network for Good from about, I don't know, like 5 years ago. And that's part of the things that, like, I encourage everybody when you're doing your research, when you're trying to understand what's happening in your own world, just check the attribution and the methodology. This goes back to Julia, what you're talking about. Like, did this survey come from 22 people and 3 dogs, and then that's it, right? Like what is the demographics? That's why in our center and in our report, extensive methodology is outlined. Same with Fundraising Effectiveness Project. We lean very hard on transparency there, so you can trust it. And so for us, I actually, for calendar year giving, I didn't want to use ours. I actually wanted to see Fundraising Effectiveness Project data. So they gave that to me, and it found that 20% or so, give or take a few percentage points, which is still significant, but like, it's not no 31%, I'll say that. And so it was about 20%, 17 to 20% came in December. Good. That's a lot in 1 month. But it actually, some of the more recent research that FEP had come out with shows that November, December, especially in the past few years, are starting to trigger some really interesting donor behavior. So I'll talk about FEP, but I do want to mention something we saw internally in our research too, for something like online giving. So some research that we found is that, I'm going to read it, so I'm doing it correct. We also found that donors whose first gift to an organization ever in November or December has a retention rate that is 53% higher than those making their first gift in the period of January and through October. We also find that they're typically making their second donation, which all of us know, is way important, many times more important than the first gift.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And that's coming around 11 to 13 months. So this begs the question. If we're slamming people with end of the year updates and communications, and then they're giving a year later, typically, because there's a big spike that happens at that 11 to 13 month. Is it because we're slamming them with communications, or is that when they prefer to give? The final interesting point that leads me to believe that I actually think that there's a fair amount of people who do like to give in December as their preference, was that FEP saw that donors who gave in the last day of the year have a lifetime value 15% higher than the average donor. And that if you play around with our interface there, we actually have day-by-day analysis of December because it's so significant. So we show that, and it spikes way more than Giving Tuesday, even online donations. Because if it's offline, going back to the thing, yikes, I forgot to enter all the checks. I got to enter all the checks, right? Like offline is not as surefire as online. And so with online, I said, okay, what happens there? A bunch of people really love to give on the 31st, way more than Giving Tuesday online. Mm-hmm. So that makes me feel like either they're getting slammed with so many communications, which yes, that might be happening, but if they didn't care, they wouldn't be given, or they would give another time, right? So.
I bet it's also geographically. So I live in Arizona. We have our qualified charitable organization tax credit state, right? We can give to several different buckets for state credit, if you will. And so for me, my cycle is not December 31. It's tax day. It's like, hey, CPA, you tell me how much
which is coming up. It's coming up.
Oh, yeah. This is very, very relevant. How much money do I need to put and in what buckets?
Each bucket.
Well, guess what? My second favorite chapter is the where chapter, and we are working on geography as part of that interface on the online.
Again, that crystal ball, I knew it. But
now I had to index it. Now you have me intrigued to actually go back and look at state giving by month too, not just as an aggregate. That's probably another round of things, but
so it's probably mid-March, mid-April, kind of that November, December trigger. It's also that March, April.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And I would also say too, it really depends on what part of the country. Let's say, for example, you're in the South or the Gulf states where you are prone to weather disasters that happen at a specific time of the year that then drives community response. The Plains, Middle America, another time of the year where you have major environmental things that can
winter storms happening on the East Coast, the nor'easters that we're typically not going to see during those summer months at all. Like we're going to be, unless it's a Sandy situation, we're typically not even worrying about stuff in a major way. Maybe it's kind of weird flooding season that's starting to happen, but it's, and there is some really interesting research around disaster timing.
Mm-hmm.
There's, I remember a graphic that I saw very early on, during the pandemic, and then there was also some follow-up analysis by Fundraising Effectiveness Project on kind of what happened in 2008, for instance.
Right.
There's a timeline that follows that, and then the typical disaster situation where you're going to see a big spike, and then a major drop off, and then you're going to see actually a second. I don't want to use wave, but you understand, another bump of giving that that occurs, especially from those major donors, the more committed people who are starting to come back. And we're seeing this, the fundraising effectiveness project data for 2021 just dropped. So even that November, December analysis was only a snapshot. The larger report just came out, afpfep.org. And there's a nice visualization that Giving Tuesday's done there too. And we're finding that those first time donors have stuck around, especially if they're on the larger side, but there's a lot of concern on the smaller gifts that are just being left behind and ignored, kind of those mid-sized donors and things like that too.
Well, and I'm sure we're seeing that also with, the war in Ukraine and seeing, so many US donors giving either, in that country or to agencies that are supporting that, that affair. Let's get even nerdier, acronym soup. Let's move into these NTEE codes, right? And let's just start off with, what the heck is this? I know it has something to do with the red tape and the IRS and, always naming something differently. So what, very basic, Tim, NTEE.
This is in many ways, the self-reported designation that you put for what do you do at your what does your nonprofit do? Okay. That's it. This is what the IRS. That's right. The IRS has. This is the IRS naming of it.
IRS designated category.
So it's the category. So they have two levels. They have the major category, which is what we filter by here. Is it healthcare? Is it human services? Is it animal and environmental? Is it religion? And then there's the sub designations that number in the hundreds that overwhelm people. We just kind of draw it up at the top level, but we could get down here, and we have done that before, where it's like, wow, it really looks like food pantries did this, or interesting, that type of, labor union did that. You can get to that level of detail, but most analysis doesn't, start with that. There's a Canadian version too of this that they're starting to do mapping between all these different government designations for international analysis.
Oh, great.
Okay, cool.
We don't have much time. You mentioned early in the episode, which was just about 20 minutes ago, that you could talk about this for hours. So the graph that we have up on the screen, it does show pretty much the same, pretty equal, except for there's this huge spike. And if my 40-plus-year-old eyes are reading me correctly, it's December 2020. And that's where it really jumps, not completely off just the chart, but doubles the majority of the other dates.
And that maintained through 2021 too. So when we get from a nerdy standpoint, the reason you don't see a lot of reports coming out, or pretty much you shouldn't see reports on 2020, the previous year's giving in January, February, is lagging data entry. It's those checks. And we see that the kind of the lagging data that comes in, the drift is the proper term for it. So the data drift is people who are like, oh, right, I forgot to put the date on this. And then they go back, and then suddenly the numbers start popping up. So we kind of wait, because we know historically there's a period of time that's the drift will be over. And so that's why you don't see data like 2021 in December until now. But held strong, same idea. People just do give a lot in November and December. This is the big aggregate time. That's when a lot of people do their appeals as well. So there definitely is correlations there, but there's also a lot of, even if we go back historically, when, the Christmas giving in England would occur, and it's our Christmas appeal, right? And things like that. And so that did carry over. As well.
I think it's cultural. And I think we see that with Ramadan and, different times of when our people are called by an action of faith or witness of faith, to participate that way. And so
if you look at the data, sorry, Julia, but to just kind of show that in terms of even the data, a lot of the stuff, we serve some religious organizations, but a lot of it is even not logged necessarily by the IRS,
right,
for reasons. And so that makes up a huge pie. And so all the major monotheistic religions have big times and periods
Absolutely.
in December. So there's a correlation.
Yeah.
Causation and correlation aren't always related, but there's definitely something happening there.
Well, yeah, I think there's a call to people. And I think also too, it becomes part of that, piece to where we fulfill that prophecy, because to your point, we're having more events. We're sending out more communications. We're doing more walks or appeals. I mean, it all works together. I think that's why I found your report so amazing.
Is there any correlation between Easter and Tax Day?
Who knows, right?
Who knows?
I really don't know, but hopefully one of our viewers, listeners will know and
maybe shed light on that. I don't know. So, well, thank you so much for having me as well.
It's been great. I want everybody to know where they can get this report. It's absolutely fascinating.
Yep.
We see a lot of data, a lot of reports that come to us at the Nonprofit Show, and a lot of them can be really Mickey Mouse, where you're like really wondering what the gravitas of this research is and how was it put together. And this is just a masterclass in how this is all done. So Tim, I'm delighted that you would come on, and that also that you could actually communicate this to us and we could discuss it, because that's the other part, is the interpretation and the vocalization of this. And then also the visual elements. So how we can get to this information. It's just so impressive. And,
think about that from the nonprofit's perspective. They should take inspiration from that, like the best way that you can actually tell your story isn't through data. It's through making the data very simple to understand. And so when it comes to your impact, it's actually a lot more effective to use an individual story to demonstrate that, right? So absolutely. And I'm so thankful and appreciative of that feedback.
Well, it's really cool. And it's the old econ major side of my brain coming out.
I went to school for history. I don't know how I got into this. So
well, I love it. Well, here's Tim's information. Again, Neon One, check them out. You can download this report. It has amazing infographics, that time slide, riveting. I played around with that for a good 30 minutes trying to figure out,
we're going to keep adding to it too. We're going to keep adding to it.
Okay, good to know. Here's Tim's information. Again, I'm Julia Patrick, CEO of the American Nonprofit Academy. Been joined by the nonprofit nerd herself, Jarrett Ransom, CEO of the Raven Group. Again, we want to thank all of our sponsors, and to let you know that if you want to share this episode with somebody else, you can find us on Roku, YouTube, Amazon Fire TV, Vimeo. And again, all of our presenting sponsors that are with us day in and day out, thank you. From Bloomerang, American Nonprofit, to your part-time controller, the Nonprofit Nerd, Fundraising Academy, the Nonprofit Atlas, Nonprofit Thought Leader, and Staffing Boutique. We say thank you for your support.
Thank you.
Wow. Okay, Tim, we are buying you a beer at AFP Icon in Vegas. I'm just witnessing.
I'll see you there. I'll get that stuff to you after. So
excited. Thank you so much.
Thanks again for having me.
Yeah, that have joined us. Please stay well so you can do well. We'll see you back here tomorrow.